Hello, and welcome to the Green Bank Network webinar series. My name is Rob Youngs, and I'll be the moderator for today's session on how the Clean Energy Finance Corporation invests in small-scale energy efficiency and clean energy. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at investing in small-scale energy efficiency and clean energy, and how the CEFC'S aggregation models work with local banks and local intermediaries. Should be a really exciting discussion today. Before we kick it off, I'll just go to the next slide here and give a brief bit of background on the Green Bank Network, the host of today's webinar. The Green Bank Network was launched 2 years ago in COP21 in Paris. It's a membership organization seeking to foster collaboration and knowledge exchange among green banks and green finance institutions around the world. It's a place to share best practices and lessons learned. And the Green Bank Network also serves as a source of knowledge for jurisdictions that are looking to establish new green banks or similar dedicated green finance initiatives. And you can learn more about the network and the concept at greenbanknetwork.org. But really, we can get more into sort of what green bank means, and I think it's a term, it's a kind of catch-all term that's used in different ways. But we're mainly talking about dedicated green finance institutions that seek to work with the private sector to finance commercial projects and crowd in more investment into the clean energy landscape. And our guest today, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, is a great example of this kind of work being done in Australia. So we're excited to have our guest presenters today, Richard Lovell, who is the Debt Markets Lead and Executive Director of Corporate and Project Finance at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. He has overall responsibility for the debt markets platform of CEFC's investment business, including green bond activity and other aggregation platforms for funding. Prior to joining CEFC, Mr. Lovell was an Executive Director in the structured and asset finance business at Westpac International Bank, and prior to that worked at Societe Generale and Perpetual Trustees, so a lot of great experience there. Our other speaker today is Yolande Pepperell from the CEFC. Yolande is the lead for CEFC's aggregation partnerships platform and is responsible for the ongoing management of the CEFC's partnership program with banks, utilities, and other financiers and intermediaries. Prior to joining the CEFC, Ms. Pepperell was most recently worked with the West Banking Corporation's commercial and industrial team and has more than 10 years of banking and finance experience. And my name, to introduce, I'm Rob Youngs. I'm the International Program Director at the Coalition for Green Capital and the Green Bank Network co-lead, and I will be the host and moderator today. And so just a few logistics on how this will run. We'll turn over the presentation in a minute here to our presenters. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type those into your chat window in the GoToWebinar interface. We'll be collecting all those questions over the course of the presentation, and then at the end we'll save time for questions, and I will ask those questions of our lovely presenters. So keep the questions coming, and with that, I will turn over the presentation to our friends at the CEFC.
Thanks, Rob. So just, as Rob's mentioned, we're keen to just give a bit of an insight in how the CEFC has invested in small-scale energy efficiency and clean energy opportunities in the Australian market. I won't cover off much more than that, just because Rob's, described the content of the webinar. But what I might just do is skip to the next slide, which shows, the mission statement of the CEFC. So there's a contents page there. I won't bother with that. So the CEFC mission statement, you can read it there. Effectively, the CEFC is a finance organisation. We're not, permitted by Australian regulatory standards to call ourselves a bank, because our regulators are very particular about such matters. But the purpose of the CEFC, which was created in around 2013, is to try and act as a catalyst, and that's really to try and bring investment into what we would refer to as clean energy sectors. Energy efficiency and renewables are two key pillars through which we do that, but also low emissions technologies. And I won't sort of go through too much detail about how we define each of those sectors at this stage, other than to say that they're relatively conventional definitions. We have quite a broad mandate, and we do seek to try and work with other partners to crowd capital in, and we're quite conscious about avoiding crowding capital out. I'll get you, Andy, just to provide a bit more background on the CEFC, because it's worth understanding the scope of what we've done to date, sort of commitments that we have out the door, and the areas in which they've been done, just to provide, I guess, a little bit of that context in the scope of the overall organisation. So, Andy, did you want to kick off with the next slide?
Thanks, Richard. So just a little bit more about the CEFC and who we are. So essentially, we're an independent Australian government organisation that operates like a traditional financier. We tap into private sector expertise both in finance and clean energy, however with a public purpose, given we're a government organisation. And I guess essentially our focus is a national one, focusing on cleaner power solutions and a better built environment. Overall, we've got access to $10 billion, seeking a commercial return on any investments that we make. And we work in both debt and equity, or for projects that are smaller, we operate as a co-financier to encourage participation in the sector from private sector financiers as well. So just to give you a little bit of a brief on the current state of our investment portfolio. So what you've got here is CEFC's year-on-year growth of the portfolio. So at the end of February, we had investment commitments of $2.5 billion. And that's net of repayments and other cancellations. So that represents growth of over 100% since June 2015. And I guess how we've got to that position is we've got now currently over 53 direct investments and 9 co-finance or aggregation programs that have delivered over 150 million in finance to more than 1,000 smaller projects and businesses across Australia. And I guess that's where we're going to focus on a little bit more today, is just that aspect of our investment portfolio. So,
I should just add that, sorry, Yolandi, I should just add those numbers are sort of changing pretty rapidly. The pipeline of deals and what we expect to close through the end of this financial year is quite substantial. So, courtesy of a couple of green bonds that we've done in the last few days, those numbers are probably about 150 million under the actual position. So it's been quite a steep ramp up this year as well.
Thanks, Richard. So just to give you a bit of a sense of cumulative investments that we've made, we're up to $3 billion in cumulative investment commitments, which was thanks to 60 plus direct investments. And in terms of total project value of those investments, it's over $7 billion, which is great to see that for every dollar of the CEFC's investments in that portfolio, we've helped catalyse $2 from the private sector. So that's great, just working on our mission of catalysing investment into the market. So I guess this is a bit of a snapshot of where we focus. As I mentioned, it's the two kind of avenues, the cleaner power solutions and a better built environment. So this just gives you an indication of the platforms, I guess, where CEFC have a focus. So under cleaner power solutions, we obviously have large-scale solar, wind, bioenergy and grid and storage solutions. And under our better built environment focus, we've got property and manufacturing, infrastructure and transport, government and universities and social housing. And so I guess the good thing about what we're talking about today is, aside from the larger scale projects, what we do under our aggregation partnership platforms is kind of across many of these actual focus areas, so we can actually have that smaller scale investment relating to some of these avenues via the aggregation partnership models that we're going to talk about further.
It's probably worth noting as well, those sectors that are described there are not, exclusive mandate requirements. They are essentially, current areas of focus where we've seen opportunity. We do things outside those areas as well as the opportunities present themselves. We've tried to align to where we see significant opportunity based on the carbon task in Australia, and also where we're seeing just flow of interest from the private sector to work with us, but we're not restricted in operating in those sectors. We have a very broad remit, which is obviously great from our perspective. So multiple sources of capital, which is the next slide. So you can see there that there are a number of channels through which we try and actually achieve investment. There's direct investment, where we work on a bilateral basis with borrowers, and those borrowers can take the form of developers of large-scale renewables projects, property asset owners, fund managers and the like, and we tend to work in that space mainly when the ticket sizes involved justify a direct bilateral engagement. It's always a bit of a balancing act as to at what point, below what size it is uneconomic for us to get involved, or below which size, we find it difficult to justify doing things on a bilateral basis. We've generally tried to keep a bit of a rule of thumb of around about $20 million. So in other words, if a likely CEFC investment ticket is below $20 million, we'll try and find ways to do that through aggregation partnerships rather than do transactions directly. There are exceptions for that for very low risk credit style borrowers such as universities, local governments, but that's an important principle for us to try and keep in mind when we do look at this question, because the reality is, as a wholesale finance business, we've got total staff of probably 70 odd people, half of whom are legal, HR, government relations, stakeholder management, communications, marketing. So the investment team is quite lean for the pipeline and the balance sheet which we have. There's reference to the debt market, so that's really a lot of what we'll probably be focusing on today. That's effectively any sort of products where we're working through debt style instruments to try and utilise the capabilities of third parties in the Australian market to tap into that opportunity set that don't fall into the CEFC direct opportunity bucket, if you like. That's taken a whole lot of forms, and we'll explore that in a lot more detail in the other slides. But we've done obviously things through green bonds, securitized style vehicles, both traditional and non-traditional securitized style transactions, and a range of other aggregation style opportunities and structures which we've basically been driven and structured around what the customer needs really are. So it's quite a customer-focused approach. Investment funds is really the equity side of the business as far as the larger scale investments are concerned. We work with well-credentialed fund managers to try and create specific mandates that are focused on our particular areas of interest, and we've done that across a range of asset types. So we've done things in the property space, in infrastructure, in renewables, the built environment more broadly, waste to energy. We've looked at creating and have in a number of those instances set up and have running funds that are attracting investment from third parties and that are seeking to deploy money as we speak. The last one there is the Innovation Fund, which is a specific subset within our business. It's not a separate entity. It sits on our balance sheet, but it's a particular allocation within our balance sheet, which was driven by a federal government initiative to focus us on what we would consider to be, somewhat more pre-commercial style investment opportunities. So that covers investment opportunities in the venture capital space, some venture debt, early stage seed capital. It will potentially include some project equity development style risk. And so it does cover things that are very much at the pointier end. The ticket sizes tend to be smaller there because the nature of the risk is different. And that's, a classic sort of venture capital style. We'll probably do, for every 10 deals we do, we'll lose our shirt on, 5 of them. We'll just get out on 3 of them, and hopefully 2 of them will make us a lot of money. So that's a reasonably traditional VC style approach, but in a market where that's been quite thin on the ground in Australia. Landy, do you want to kick off from there?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So as Richard mentioned, that was a bit of an overview of the CEFC in general, and I guess now we'll move to focus on today's webinar, which is CEFC'S aggregation financing solutions are designed to overcome difficulties in accessing upfront capital for smaller clean energy investment projects. Large and small-scale businesses can find it challenging to implement small-scale energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, requiring a different approach. CEFC today is going to provide some insights into our successful aggregation finance models, and we're going to cover off how they work, the benefits to each of the parties involved, what achievements we believe we've made to date, and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. So that's just a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover off from here. But as Richard mentioned, just focusing more on that debt markets piece and just giving you some examples of how we've structured these types of investments.
Thanks, Yolandi. So we thought it was worth just putting in some information about what we were seeing as some of the key barriers to investment in energy efficiency, and the same issues apply certainly in Australia with regard to small-scale renewables. Large-scale renewables are driven by a lot of regulatory factors in Australia, which we won't touch on here because they're out of scope. But these same comments apply across both energy efficiency and clean energy. So the IEA has done quite a bit of work on this. Their summary is that basically businesses are not necessarily aware of the efficiency benefits, and that businesses have struggled with the complexity around some of the decisions relating to capital investment in energy efficiency and clean energy. And it is complicated by complex pricing models around electricity, and there's a certain level of business inertia. If you look at the blue box on the right-hand side, these are probably some of the things which we have seen become apparent in the Australian market. So it tends to be small transaction size, but high transaction costs, and that means that models have had to be evolved to deal with that factor. A lot of financiers are just looking for very low transaction cost models with scalable, delivery. Energy efficiency tends, and small scale renewables tend to be quite bespoke in nature. So that's a challenge. It's quite a broad universe. It's not easily brought together and homogenised. And we see that in the sort of deals that we've done, which have ranged from chestnut processing equipment through to low emissions vehicles, through to industrial technology, micro wind generators, solar technology for pumping, for irrigation in agribusiness. There's just a whole range of things, and it's difficult for people to wrap their head around it and seek scale in those kind of diverse markets. We do find a lot that there is an issue with split incentives between owners of assets and the people who are using them, and for the most case that's tenants in real property transactions. So in Australia, as in a number of other jurisdictions, the tenants are paying the electricity bill, but the assets are owned by someone who doesn't really care, therefore, about whether or not the electricity bill goes down. That's meant that owners have been reluctant to invest in energy efficiency because they just don't see the upside, or it's much less difficult for them to see the upside. Difficulties financing energy efficiency against cash flows. This point is really that conventional finance methods are available. People can access those. That's fine. What has not really developed yet, certainly in the Australian market, has been models whereby people can get specific financing for specific energy efficiency based on the benefit that flows from the reduction in electricity costs. There are models which have been deployed to varying degrees of success in other markets, but you know, we have seen issues with that. You know, if I had to summarise, you know, the biggest issue that we do see in Australia, and what we've grappled with the most, is that businesses tend to be very focused on revenue accretive investment opportunities. They are much less focused on cost reduction investment opportunities. That's a bit of a cultural thing in Australia. It might be common in other jurisdictions as well. So you can go to them with an opportunity which, you know, will have a very short payoff period, but, you know, unless they're making more money out of it, you know, you pretty quickly lose focus. So that has also been an issue. Yolanda?
So when we look to actually finance energy efficiency, we kind of look at it from a number of different views. So I guess we have a goal. So we want to identify sources of capital to support that sort of investment. And as Richard said, you know, our focus is across low emissions, energy efficiency and renewables. Our approach is, I guess, to date has been to develop structured investments. So working with a number of different structures and parties, just to, I guess, tap into the little gaps in the market and where we see the opportunities as being. So in particular, working with co-financiers in that space. And those programs to date, I guess, have been targeted to the needs of small business manufacturers. We've had a significant focus in the agricultural sector, as well as small-scale commercial property. So as Richard touched on, addressing things like equipment upgrades, general building upgrades, variable speed drives, irrigation systems and the like. And I guess by having that focus and targeting that sector, what we're hoping to achieve is encouraging private sector finance into these projects, and also bringing it front of mind to those parties as well to create new opportunities for investing, I guess, for people who are looking to increase their exposure in that clean energy or green project space. And that's kind of what we've seen as we've progressed, is just a little bit more investment in different manners into those projects. So in follow-on from that, I guess where we've seen the biggest focus, as I just mentioned, has been primarily in two areas. So property. We do a lot of property in our direct capital approach, so where we use either debt or equity instruments, and we can kind of fund individual projects, as well as we've done some projects via funds, either new or existing. But we've also done property in the aggregation models, also some smaller scale property upgrades and the like, and we'll run you through some examples of the structures there. I think one of the biggest impacts we've had is in the equipment finance space, where we work through, I guess, third parties to deliver some degree of concessional finance for people who choose to purchase energy efficient equipment, vehicles and the like. So that's where we've kind of seen the focus of our investment to date go in this space. So Rich is going to just talk us through, I guess, a few of the examples of our approach and the different types of structures of some of our projects, programs and funds. Are you there, Richard?
Sorry, my apologies. You can see there, you know, we've grouped it into three subsets, and you know, it's a little challenging to develop common threads between some of these, just because, you know, maybe this is a reflection of the early stage of the Australian market, but you know, there are, you know, in the other category, a big group of different types of things that we've done, which, you know, you can't necessarily easily categorise. So I'll give a bit more colour. we have done a reasonable amount of work, and we are doing more in traditional securitization style transactions, and there's 3 transactions there, and I encourage anybody who's interested to have a look at our website, and they can easily have a look at the fact sheets on any given transaction, and you'll be able to see them when you go onto the website. But those transactions, those securitization transactions take quite a conventional approach, and I'll outline the key elements of that in another slide. The asset types that you can see across that securitization bucket, encompass operating leases for low emissions and zero emission vehicles, small scale solar in the case of Flexi Group, and a broader set of energy efficiency and low emission vehicles in the case of the First Mac transaction. We're doing more in that securitization space. I do expect it to increase, but slowly. It's a more challenging credit structure than some of the others. The credit intermediated style transactions, what does that really mean? What that effectively means is that we work with parties like, and you can see we've got 3 of the 4 major banks in Australia there, Commonwealth Bank, NAB and Westpac, and there's a couple of others as well. Those parties are all obviously very high-grade credits. They have extremely strong distribution capabilities. I would estimate that probably 60 to 70% of all small business lending in the Australian market is covered by the 4 major banks in Australia. And so working with those kind of counterparties is critical to be able to reach out to the breadth of potential customers who are looking for energy efficiency and small-scale renewables opportunities. So we work with those counterparties. There are various evolutions of what this will look like, and we'll cover that off again a little bit later, but the structures for the most part involve us providing funding to those entities, and the same is true of Origin and Monash, through conventional debt structures, but basically providing a level of concessionality for through those debt structures, which those counterparties, and it's easiest to think about it for the banks, those counterparties can go and lend to acceptable energy efficiency assets and customers, and they are effectively allowed or able to provide those customers a discount if they make choices to invest in energy efficiency and low emissions technologies and small scale renewables. So what does that really mean? If NAB have a customer come to them in the agribusiness space who just want to buy a tractor, NAB can say to them, yep, we can finance your tractor if you choose a tractor which has got acceptable levels of fuel efficiency and therefore carbon efficiency, you will qualify for a certain discount. And we will essentially, through our structured funding, fund that discount so that NAB are neutral either way, except for the fact that they have a marketing tool to go out and talk to those customers, but the customer is incentivized to make appropriate energy efficiency choices. We've worked with parties like Origin, who are one of the large energy retailers down here, and Monash through a green bond structure to basically provide funding where we're not taking the underlying credit risk on those customers. We don't get involved in the process of those customers and their interactions with their bank. We are one step back from it, but we provide financing structures so as to incentivize the underlying customer choice. That leads us to a pretty easy credit decision. We've just got to then make sure that the transactions are appropriately structured, and we'll cover those off in a little bit more detail. In the other category, there's a whole range of things which we've done. So to give you a bit of a sense of the spectrum of things that are in there, Eureka Funds Management are property specialists, and we've looked at doing effectively the equivalent of a commercial style PACE type structure through what we would refer to as energy upgrade agreements. That's been slow to deploy, and there's some learnings from that, which we'll cover off later. AMP, Palisade, Investor, EG, and Frontier are all varying types of equity investments in funds where we've chosen to make strategic investments through particular frameworks with those fund managers to drive the way in which they deploy their capital. Artesian is quite an interesting example. Artesian are effectively a venture capital seed fund specialist who take, quite an interesting approach to early stage investing. They don't try and pick winners. They cover a sector, make very small bets, and try and follow on in further capital rounds with early stage VC companies where they've been successful. We've given them money, and that has been effectively matched by a further, we put a $10 million investment with Artesian. They went out and sourced a further $20 million from other private capital in the market to invest in that way in the clean tech sector. So there's a whole range of different ways in which we've done things in that other category. Moving on to the next slide, what is the approach which we actually take? I guess that the way that I'd summarise it, as I'd mentioned before, is that we try and focus on what the customer needs are. So we have quite a flexible product capability. Securitization is a relatively traditional, just covering each of them off, securitization is a relatively traditional approach. We look at what potential loss is on a granular pool of assets. We work out what the proxies are if we can't observe directly what the loss experience has been historically. We fund through a bankruptcy remote vehicle. The use of our funds is only for eligible assets. We make sure that there are tests in place to require that assets have met our criteria, and there are penalties that apply if assets have been written that don't meet our criteria. And that involves us taking the actual credit exposure to the underlying assets. Now that's typically with the benefit of some level of loss protection from the equity sponsor for appropriate alignment with the equity sponsor. But if those assets were all to stop paying, and that means basically widespread credit default by underlying borrowers, we would lose money. The credit intermediated structure, as I've talked about before, we have an credit exposure to the borrower, but not the underlying asset. So we will be repaid if the bank, if we're thinking about the bank programs, we will get repaid provided the bank is still solvent, even if they were to have written a bunch of bad credits and all those assets default. And that means it's possible for us to provide, obviously, better pricing. The borrowers have to be undertaking, and this is similar to securitization structures, the borrowers have to be undertaking appropriate lending or projects or activities according to a pre-agreed criteria. Where we have similar counterparties, for example, across the banks in the Australian market, we keep criteria and frameworks as uniform as possible so that all market participants know that they're on even terms with us, and that's been very important. We have testing to confirm compliance, so we don't just rely on those counterparties to say that the assets are eligible. We go in and we test. We do that on typically an annual basis, in some instances more frequently. And as I've talked about, the funding structured so that the relevant aggregation partners focus in on what we consider eligible assets. There's some benefits to those structures which I'll cover in a little bit more detail, but they're quite flexible and have been quite successful in getting funds deployed. The other category, as I said, is is a bit of a bag of licorice all sorts as to how those actually work. But we have sought to structure those according to what the needs of the sector have been. To give an example, in the bioenergy and bio-waste sector, what we found is that in Australia, we were underpenetrated for that technology. There were a lot of potential projects because of Australia being quite a heavily agricultural-based economy. The opportunities just weren't being developed. We were standing in the market saying we'll do debt funding for these things all day, and people would come to us and they couldn't get their EPC contracts, they couldn't get the construction contracts sorted out, couldn't get their off-takes agreed with energy retailers, couldn't get connection issues sorted. There were environmental permitting concerns, just a lot of issues that basically as a debt financier we just couldn't solve. So we were sitting there waiting to fund stuff, and it just wasn't happening. With that in mind, we worked with Frontier, who are a specialist bio-waste and bioenergy fund manager. We're working for them to set up a fund down here which will put equity to work in that sector so that they can bring their expertise to bear and just basically solve those problems. they're working on getting parallel equity to sit alongside us at the moment for that fund, but that's an example of how we've sought to structure the way in which we do things in a manner that reflects the shortfalls in the market. Yolandi might just comment a little bit in more detail on those bank programs, mainly because they're sort of relatively large and high profile and have been quite successful from a deployment perspective, and just give a bit more colour around what the experience has been like with those programs.
Yeah, so the co-financing programs obviously sit under that credit intermediated structure that Richard was just referring to, and so we just wanted to just briefly touch on those in particular, given that they're with 3 of the 4 major Australian banks. So all of them focus on asset finance for those energy efficiency or renewable technologies and across a range of asset classes as we've kind of referred to. And so what they basically do is offer those incentivised terms for the customer to encourage this type of investment. So you'll see that they're quite similar. It's more about it being a uniform kind of market and approach for them, and then they can differentiate themselves by what their focus is rather than the actual terms of the actual equipment finance program. So all of them offer discounted interest rates, loans up to $5 million for a range of loan structures and terms up to 10 years, which is just a little bit outside of standard asset finance arrangements in Australia, which are generally 3 to 5 years. So that's just a brief overview of those co-financing programs in particular. So this is one of probably the most important aspects we wanted to run through today, which is just really like why would you consider programs of this structure? And so we thought it was important to run through what the actual benefits were for those that we've partnered with and for the end consumers. And then we're going to touch on the benefits for us as an organisation as well. So why would a financier want to work with us? I guess the major things that we've highlighted in respect to this are that the programs encourage personal development and upskilling of staff. So they have to learn about the program, about the technology, about energy savings. They need to think about a customer's energy use. And it also allows them to consider financing for other assets that were previously non-standard, I guess. The financier has the decision in their control, I guess, is another important aspect. So aside from the program framework and asset eligibility, the finance decision rests still in the hands of the finance partner. And I think that's a really important consideration for them to take on board. It minimises interference with standard customer processes. So essentially, the design of the programs is that it utilises the financier's existing systems, processes, documentation and decision making. And I guess it just simply focuses that expertise and process on a select group of eligible assets rather than reinventing the wheel, trying to align with how they do things already. It can influence at the borrower's decision point. So I guess being involved with a borrower at the point of purchase is really, it's really important. It allows the financier an opportunity to actually influence a purchase decision. So if the customer steered their purchase towards a more efficient model or choice, they would receive the discounted financing amongst other benefits. So it sort of allows them to play an important role in that decision-making process. It doesn't diminish the financier's position in the market. So what I mean by that is the borrower still deals directly with that financier and suppliers as they would in any other circumstance. So the programs are essentially identical and therefore it provides that level playing field for the financier, and that allows them to add value to their customer by what they can offer them and by being involved in the actual the process. And I guess the other really important thing for a financier is in an ever-changing market, I guess the flexibility to shift focus. So we've said, for example, batteries there, as newer technologies enter the market, the programs are all designed to have the ability to adapt, amend and update the assets that can be funded, which just allows the financier to be dynamic in their approach to what assets are eligible and what they can offer their customers. So we feel like that's probably 6 of the most important considerations for a financier in these partnerships. And then, I guess, to the customer, equally important is a simple and fast lending process. So I guess essentially what a customer sees is a business as usual process. So as per their normal expectation of an asset finance process, it's no different just with our involvement in the actual transaction. The programs can accelerate capital investment for other positive benefits. I guess what we've seen to date is if people are being incentivised to upgrade either early or to better equipment, we've seen improvements in safety as well as just the performance of the equipment, but also yield. I guess in the agricultural sector, we've seen a lot of positive benefits just to do with other avenues of a customer's business. It allows them to maintain their existing banking relationships, and that's really important for the end customer. There's no direct involvement from CEFC with that customer, which just means that there's no confusion to the customer as to exactly who they're borrowing from, who they're reporting to, and the like. And I think that's where we've kind of gone a little bit wrong previously, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think that's quite an important element for an end customer in their consideration. There's obviously discounted financing costs, longer terms, and other benefits in terms of the actual structure itself. So that's always great. I guess a lower cost of investing in energy efficiency is a win for the customer. And what we've seen is improved energy productivity. So the benefits to them in terms of energy costs as well as performance of their actual business has been significant to date. So that's another actual benefit there for the end customer. And so Rich is just going to cover off what the benefits we see for us as CEFC are in regards to providing these structures to a financier and then down through to an end customer.
Yeah, thanks for that. So in fact, some of them parallel the experiences for the financiers and the partners. So, one of the things that it does allow is a relatively flexible approach. So we can flex over an availability period, for deployment of the funds, what it is that is focused on. And we have done that. So, for example, we've had programs in place where we'd probably too loosely define some of the energy efficiency gains around certain types of equipment. And whilst we didn't have instances of partners actively seeking to game that outcome or put assets in that weren't appropriate, what we found is that it was creating some areas of ambiguity, and some assets being funded which were probably a little bit marginal. We refined that as we went along and reflected that through into other programs, but that door can swing both ways. So we set the structures up so that parties can come to us and say, well, what about this particular type of equipment that we may not have originally contemplated? That can then be included, subject to it meeting basic requirements around eligibility. We, from time to time, as I imagine would happen with a lot of different similar organisations to ourselves, are subject to, I won't call them the whims, but the changing focus areas of our political masters, and these structures are flexible to deal with that. There's a big focus at the moment in Australia on storage and batteries, and so these structures allow us to then encourage and work with partners to try and focus in on that and make sure that we're giving appropriate opportunities for that type of technology. Obviously, the big benefit is that we are just never going to deal with a lot of the customers that these financiers will deal with. We just don't have enough people and enough bums on seats, frankly, to access all of the relationships that are out there. The customer base of the banks and of other partners with whom we work are vast, and really it's about trying to direct those relationships in a manner which suits our public policy objectives. And so being able to leverage those relationships and that distribution platform is clearly an extremely powerful tool for us. I think realistically, if you were thinking about doing energy efficiency funding in the Australian market and you didn't have some kind of way of getting the major banks to do it, at least in Australia, you would be wasting your time. You would just be nibbling around the edges. The interesting thing, has increased market reach and awareness. So each time we've done a deal like this, it's sparked interest from other people. We disclose all our deals, and there is something of a herd mentality in the Australian financing market generally. If you do a deal with one counterparty, they all want to do the same thing, and that's fine. So that can be a great way of getting a bit of increased focus on our preferred approach. It's clearly cost effective. We just can't access those counterparties unless we go through intermediaries and take these types of approaches. But we have to do it in a low-touch way. So that relatively hands-off structure, and it's subject to appropriate hindsight reviews. That relatively hands-off structure means it's cost-effective. It probably drives your landy wild, but you're having to do all the work to keep all the banks in line and to deal with all their questions. But happily, she does a great job of it, and that's an effective way for us to engage with what is effectively 60 to 70% of the SME market in Australia. Obviously, it catalyses investments in emissions, which is the key thing to some extent. So moving on, why does it work? And these are probably, I suppose, a reflection of, the CEFC'S experience, and these are, cheat notes as to how we've managed to use these programs to get things happening. Some of these points we've already covered. So the scale, things below $5 million, you can be quite down to quite small amounts. It's an effective way of doing that and lifting the profile of energy efficiency as a potential investment opportunity for businesses. And really, these aggregation partnerships are the only way in which we can do it. It does also encourage banks to focus on these assets, and things like securitisation structures will ultimately be brought to market with these types of assets in them, and that will represent yet another method of crowding in capital. So the banks do intermediate in Australia. They do intermediate a significant proportion of the capital investment in the country. But if we're to do all the things that we need to do to meet objectives under things like the Paris Accord, then we need to get greater sources of capital than just the balance sheets of the Australian banks. And doing this work with these kind of counterparties and the securitisation transactions we've got as an example are developments that will allow for crowding in of even further sources of capital, and mainly that's the superannuation sector. So the equivalent of pension funds in Australia are now bigger than the banks and are an enormous source of capital. They're pretty slow. You've got to try and design products that suit their needs, and so these types of approaches can do that. As I said, you can play on that herd mentality. It's fair to say that 2 of the 3 bank programs which we have in place were, let's just say, encouraged by the presence of the first one in the market and bankers going out there and cutting people's grass with their customers. And so we've tried to equip, with organisations that were willing and capable to equip everybody with those same tools so that people can access those same benefits. And as I mentioned, we can fiddle around with the programs once you've got them set up, and they're quite flexible in doing that. So maybe moving on to some of the positive outcomes, Andy.
Yolandi, are you on there?
just touching on the part one, driving the market. So I think we touched on the banking programs, and so this is a focus on those in particular. So what we've done to date is over 150 million via 1,000 plus projects. It's actually a little bit more than that now. I think we're over 170 million to date. And that's seen over 900 projects for lower emissions light vehicles and farm machinery, over 300 building upgrades, manufacturing or process equipment upgrades, and over 180 solar PV installations. So I guess that's one positive outcome, is just the fact that we are driving that market uptake. And another positive outcome of the finance structure is just that that aspect of improving energy efficiency. So this is just a little snapshot. I'm not going to run through it all, but just to actually reflect that an end customer is seeing the benefit of these programs as well. They're not only cutting costs, but as we touched on before, improving that energy productivity. So the businesses are benefiting from these energy efficiency programs by reducing their energy usage, slashing energy bills, and reducing running costs, including using less power and better water control. So there's just a couple of examples there of some of the individual transactions we've done under some of those banking programs. And then this is just a snapshot of a further transaction that we've done under the NAB program in particular, which was a school in Bundaberg in Queensland. And they not only have installed, obviously, water tanks and solar PV, but it also forms part of their actual learning platform for sustainable and technology with their students. So that's another example of what we've a positive outcome of the finance structure for the end borrower.
Just looking at some of the other aspects of the financing structure, I guess, again, sort of to some extent, cheat notes are some of the ways that we've gone about things to try and get stuff out of these financing structures, over and above just purely the carbon outcomes from the actual lending activity. So if you pick a market leader who's aligned and who is highly motivated to do extra work to kind of push to make things happen, and you work with them to probably to give a little more than you would in the long term potentially want to give, you can then crowd in other market participants. You then have to normalise those programs so that everybody's on the same terms, but famously, it's not always the second mouse that gets the cheese. Sometimes you've got to do a bit of work, a bit more work up front with people, and it's always wise to pick strong leaders who have alignment. Some of the other positive outcomes, we do push to try and work with partners to ensure that information on the performance of the underlying assets and the behaviour of customers and the types of technologies that are getting done, that flows out to the market. So for all of these programs, we do case studies of the examples of the underlying small-scale energy efficiency investments so that people can see the sorts of things that are being done. The more information that's out there, the more that people will see it as a viable investment opportunity, and that's critical in the long run. I think the other thing is that it does potentially offer scope for financiers to address constraints in other parts of their businesses. So in Australia, and I know this is the case in Europe, it's less so in North America. Banks are very constrained in relation to their mortgage lending, and that's a regulatory-driven issue. These types of programs can provide an impetus to focus them and to pivot towards energy efficiency and asset finance in our preferred areas as a growing asset class, and that can be a significant driver of future activity, even where we're not involved, if you can try and change their focus a little bit. So we have seen banks seek to do more in this space as a result of them turning their attention towards it, following us doing these programs. So lessons learned, which is sort of interesting, is that we have had plenty of failures. Working through some of the ones that you see there. So market appetite. We had a long and somewhat illustrious list of people come through our offices telling us how PPAs were going to reshape the Australian market, and we're obviously aware of the structure of the US market. And these guys were, true believers. The PPAs were going to be the next big thing. We put a lot of work in, tried to support who we considered to be the credible players in the market, and pretty much nothing happened. The reality is that was a reflection of the cultural nature of a cultural reflection of Australia's approach. So Australian businesses want to own assets. They hate complexity, and they don't like taking a punt on future power prices going the way they want. They just want to be able to. I mean, they're all interested in what future power prices are doing, but they're quite happy to just own the equipment. They had, frankly, zero interest in PPAs. And the flood of people coming to our offices looking for funding for funds for PPAs has dwindled to a trickle, and we don't really do those deals anymore. So it was probably unavoidable, but it just wasn't clear the level of devotion Australians had to asset ownership. So one is that point about understanding what the market is going to want to do. Another point. Design of the underlying products for customers. So we talked previously about energy upgrade agreements, similar to PACE style structures, but because the local market doesn't have scale, it was limited to certain geographic areas and certain types of commercial buildings, at least in its initial incarnation. You couldn't get homogenous product. The legislative bodies that were responsible for designing the product didn't listen to financiers, and I was part of the consultation process, so they didn't listen to financiers and talk about and address some of the shortcomings which financiers saw. As a result, the product was, frankly, it was virtually unbankable on a wholesale financier basis. Also, the product didn't really suit the underlying customers. It just, again, too complex. They could get cheaper forms of funding elsewhere. Now, having said all of that, we've seen a bit of an uptake lately, which may change. It might be coming of age as people get more comfortable with it, but I remain to be convinced. So product design, is key. The last point is, where we've designed structures that were poor. So prior to the current bank programs, we had structures in place where we would participate alongside banks. We would effectively split the risk on transactions. That meant we had to re-underwrite, or co-underwrite, I should say, from a credit perspective, relatively small loans. And whilst we have good credit guys, we're not set up to do small business credit. It annoyed customers no end. No customer in the world has ever said, I'd really love to go through 2 credit processes. They have a hard enough time going through one. So that was, frankly, problematic. The money never got lent because customers just didn't want to do it. And also, and I'm not suggesting that this actually happened, but because of the nature of that type of program, we were exposed to the risk that an unscrupulous bank or bankers within a bank would effectively try and channel the deals to us that they otherwise couldn't get through their credit departments, and that we would be getting the fish that John West rejected. So that was an inherent risk in that program design, which we've effectively terminated. It just wasn't efficient. So there's a few lessons there. I think make sure that your design is structured, by people who understand how banks operate, or whomever the partner is with which you're working. Try and understand your market, and spend a bit of time understanding the underlying product and talking to stakeholders about it before you plough a lot of time and effort in. But there's the lessons learned, fortunately for us, haven't involved any credit defaults, and have more been sort of time and effort spent on deals which haven't gone anywhere. So where to from here? What do we see as the next stage of development? A lot of opportunities. So we're quite happy playing through multiple channels. The banks, great. Finance companies that we do securitization structures with are great. We do see merit in supporting new business models like peer-to-peer lending or marketplace lending. So we're looking at that quite heavily at the moment, with a view to trying to crowd in some level of retail co-investment, which I think would be really interesting because it's a certain amount of disintermediation. The green bond market, I'll leave the capital solutions point to the last. The green bond market is developing down here. So as I mentioned, we've done a couple of deals in the last little while, last few days. We'll see more issuer types, more underlying asset types. We will want to support that to try and encourage markets to focus on taking direct risk on underlying assets and get that capital flowing through to small-scale energy efficiency. Capital structures really reflect the fact that banks are not really constrained for funding. The programs we have in place really deliver funding to them. What banks are really constrained by, and this is true globally and certainly in Australia, banks are really constrained by capital. They're all under capital pressure as a result of Basel changes. And so we are working on structures that will allow us to provide capital solutions to direct their investment. That has the benefit of having a much greater leverage. So rather than for every dollar you fund the bank for, they will do $1 of lending. If you provide capital solutions, they'll do 10 times the amount of lending. It does require a much deeper credit appetite and a much more sophisticated credit analysis. So that is the downside. But look, there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of different potential types of structures. We continue to see the list of assets and technology which meet our eligibility criteria expand, and we continue to do work on that in areas like heavy vehicles, which are quite challenging. So there's a lot of opportunities for the future. There's some more slides which are available that people can look at. So there's the Australian Bioenergy Fund, which is the Frontier Fund, which I mentioned there. And I'd encourage you to have a look at them and certainly ask us any questions. There's operating lease deals that case studies and examples like this are easily available on our website for anybody that wants to have a look and see the things we've done. But look, that's probably it from us. So obviously more than happy to take any questions in any form.
Great, thank you so much, and really appreciate the great presentation. Covered a lot there, and we have had some questions coming in here. Several of them have sort of been answered, I think, over the course of the discussion. But I've got one here around marketing. Basically, with the partner banks, is there sort of an active marketing? Do you help them, or is there training assistance with the marketing on the marketing side to help connect them with end buyers with the right technology, or is that all kind of done by the partner bank themselves?
Oh, Yolandi, you're probably the best place to do that one if you're happy to.
Okay. So the programs initially, we have a very consultative process on the marketing plan itself. And what components, what aspects kind of filter into that. So obviously with the experience we've had on current programs to date, we can kind of provide some feedback and guidance in relation to how they should approach. But a lot of the marketing is definitely guided by what their internal focuses are, where their kind of strengths are in terms of sectoral application or businesses. But then I guess once the program comes on and it's active, that promotion is then up to the banks themselves to a certain extent. So they might do customer events, roadshows, a lot of kind of external marketing. And we also complement that with our own event schedule. So we talk about all of the program finance we have at various events, functions, conferences, workshops, just to promote all of CEFC'S financing programs sort of agnostically, just to complement each of the banks or partners' individual marketing approach.
I think the only comment I'd add to that is that we often get direct. So there's two things. First of all, we do push partners very hard up front on their marketing approach that they're going to take, because you have to make sure that funds are going to be successfully deployed, and unless people have thought about how they're going to do the marketing, just the thing just flops. And so we do push them to come up with a very clearly articulated marketing approach. The second point is that we as Yolanda's mentioned, we get a lot of direct inquiries from people of all sorts of varying degrees of, seriousness and credibility and so forth, about, potential to fund, various things. If they're not things that we would do directly and we consider them to be legitimate, we will refer those opportunities through to aggregation partners, either on a tailored basis where there's a specific need that would fit a specific program, or on a channel agnostic basis if more than one partner could do the deal, so that there are opportunities. So it's dealing with an even hand across all of those people. So yeah, we do a fair bit of work on that front, particularly up front, and then we do support people on an ongoing basis, but we to some extent fold into the approach that they'd like to take once we've assessed that it seems reasonable and is appropriately professional.
Great, thank you. Scott, just maybe one more. I realize we're over time here, so gonna maybe wrap it up with one more question here. We've got how does aggregation actually come into play? Is it just through securitization, or seek to have bundle the assets within the banks in a way that to spread risk? And a related question: do participating banks have to meet a certain threshold of number of deals or total ticket size to be able to participate?
Yeah, so in relation to the first one, the securitization models that we have in place, we pool those assets and fund those assets directly and take credit risk on those assets through a pooled securitization style approach. There'll typically be equity coming from the sponsor as a first loss piece. The bank programs, aggregation is a sort of a term of art within the CEFC to refer to models where we are getting other parties to bring those opportunities together on their existing platforms. So the assets continue to sit on the balance sheets of the banks, focusing on the banks. The aggregation in that sense is simply that we've provided a framework and a structure under which the bank will collectively report on those things, think about them, and provide information to us about the assets that are being written and that come under that structured financing approach. So it's something of a notional aggregation. It's governed by an overall relationship with the bank, which specifies pre-agreed criteria, which probably leads on to the second point of the question about certain minimum volumes and so on. To date, we've only dealt with parties where we will probably only continue to deal with partners where we have a high degree of certainty that they're going to be able to deploy funds in a meaningful way. If we thought that it was uncertain as to whether they were going to be actually able to access the market, we would probably tell them to go away, prove themselves, and come back to us when they show that they can actually originate assets in a professional manner. The banking market down here is very mature. It's very easy to see the candidates, and there's obviously the four major banks, and there's various tiers below that, but it's a small market, and we know all of those organisations very well and understand their capabilities. So we assess those. That's why we put a lot of rigour around the marketing to make sure they're not just going to, the whole thing's not just going to, die a slow and painful death. So we do push around that, but there's no minimum startup requirement. We tend to prefer not to refinance existing assets, but rather to focus on new assets wherever we can.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. And just being respectful of folks' time here, we had a lot of good questions, but I think folks can feel free to follow up. You've got the contact information there on the screen, and you can also reach out to us via the Green Bank Network for more questions broadly about these type of institutions. And so I'd just like to thank our presenters today for a really, really great presentation. And with that, we'll sign off and catch you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Cheers.